come yesterday to the 2:45 assembly. We failed to get a quorum. So we meet, and those of you who are new may not understand this, but the assembly is our governing body. We meet once a quarter. If we don't get a quorum, we cannot do any official business. So please make a note of it in your mind for next quarter, which that'll be what, June? Whenever the next assembly is, because they count who's on Zoom. The quorum would require 45 people. We made it to 40.
Following up on that, Carol, I think one of the items just on yesterday's program was identifying nominees to be candidates for the nominating committee. Mm-hmm. And if you could send me the names of those that you recommend with their permission, I can then deal with the issue of whether we need to have an election or not for that.
Joe, you had a...
Can you attend by Zoom?
Yes.
Okay,
People did.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people did. And usually the president, and last time Tom Corboy sent out the link for it in the announcement. Okay, well then let's welcome today's speaker. Our speaker today is Dr. Richard Knowles. Richard has been a member of ASPEC since 2010, and he has co-led the complexity group for many years. He has had a stellar career with diverse experience, and I was looking at his CV, which is several pages long, so I cut it down because we want to hear from him. So I'm going to focus on just a few of those. He did his undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and received his PhD in organic chemistry. Like us, that's what I did. So fellow organic chemist, I'm delighted. From University of Rochester. And he then joined the DuPont company, where he worked in different areas, fields of agricultural chemicals, industrial chemicals, process development, flame retardants, and many other areas. And he is the recipient of 40 US patents for his work. So currently, Richard is the president of Richard N. Knowles and Associates, and he runs that business with his wife. His focus is on helping organizations to use systems thinking to solve complex problems. He has worked with teams all over the world, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and so on for over the last 20 years. So today we will be hearing from him on democracy in the US and the systems view on that. So please take it away. Oh, how would you like to handle questions?
As we go along, questions will be fine.
Okay.
If we don't finish, that's fine too,
Okay. And
it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Having been with the complexity group for so long, this is a massive crowd. I learned a lot with the complexity group here as we've talked together, and recently, over the last 4 years, I've gotten involved with a group called the Forum on Democracy, which is centralized in Washington, D.C. area, although people from all over the world are in it. Just talking about what's going on with democracy, what's going on with our country. One of the interesting things I've learned is that for the most part, we've moved away from being citizens to being consumers.
Are we recording?
yes, yes, we are.
Where's the camera? Oh, the camera's on him. Good.
So we've moved away from being citizens to consumers. So people more and more are sitting back, ordering stuff off of Amazon, wanting stuff from the government, doing less and less resourcefulness from themselves, as was done in the earlier days. And so there's fundamental changes, and we're trying to understand what's going on. Having worked through, excuse me, a lot of complexity things, and then learning more and more from these folks in this group about the Constitution and what was happening at the time, I got really curious. I wondered if these folks ever were using some of the ideas out of complexity and chaos, although the language wasn't there at the time, the theory wasn't there at the time. But maybe they were using these things intuitively. And when I was first, in the early days as a plant manager for DuPont, I was using a lot of this stuff intuitively, and it was working. But I didn't know what I was doing. But the results kept getting better and better. And I began to have this fear that somebody from corporate DuPont would come and ask me, what are you doing to make all these good results? Because we cut our injury rates 97%, emissions went down 95%, earnings went up 300%. You know, that's pretty good stuff. But I was afraid someone was going to ask me, well, how'd you do it? And all I could tell them was that I was walking around talking with the people. And I spent about 5 hours a day for 8 years walking, talking and listening, trying to encourage people to stand up and do things for themselves that they could do, make decisions close to the work. I could sit in my office and make a whole bunch of decisions and not have the faintest idea in the world what was happening out there for a pipe fitter on the job that morning. You know, what was he running into or she running into? So it's being out with the people was really important. I've been using these kind of ideas for a long time. I really began to get into it in about 1986. I've used these ideas as a plant manager. I've written some books and papers and acted with the ASPEC complexity group, which was very helpful for me because I could test ideas out on these folks and, you know, and see how they would fly, and it was pretty good. I'm in a consistent learning process, so I'll learn some more today. John asked me, how come you're not more involved with ASPEC? I said, I'm still working. So last week I did a seminar for the Canadian Institute of Chemical Engineers about safety. And I write newsletters and whatnot, so we keep plugging along trying to make a difference, because the things we've learned here using this kind of thinking are extraordinarily powerful. Now here are some of the ideas that come to mind as we talk about complex systems. The world is a living system. It's not a machine, it's a living system. We are a living system here. We're not machines. Organizations behave as if they're living systems. And I say as if because they do a lot of like living systems. They're not exactly like a human body, but nevertheless, we're more similar. Organizations are more similar to a human body than they are to the motor in our car. In this complexity thing, and we just have lots of interconnected parts. And it's dynamical. Everything is moving all the time. And they're open to the flow of information and energy. And there's emergence. Whenever we get together, just as today, for example, new ideas will begin to percolate up in your mind. You may express them or you may just ruminate on them. But there's going to be new stuff percolating up that none of us have ever thought about before. And that always happens when we come together in conversation. It never fails, as long as people are willing to listen to each other and talk together, like we did in the previous session. And new things come up. It always happens. You have this phenomenon of sensitive dependence to initial conditions. You've probably heard of the butterfly effect. The small changes can have great amplification or they can die off, and you don't know when you start. We just don't know what's going on. You know, what are the implications of all the work here at ASPEC and these discussion groups that get together? We don't know. And sometimes it'll be 30 or 40 years before something bubbles up. Our systems are self-organizing. ASPEC is a self-organized group. Nobody's assigned you all to come here. You all kind of just do it. And you had some ground rules about, we're gonna try to be respectful of one another and that sort of thing, which keeps us together so we don't blow up. But there are things that hold us together, so self-organization has to have some kind of a way to hold it together or it explodes. Because everybody goes in a different direction and you can't hold it. And you need a variety of people to solve complex problems. We can do a lot ourselves, but if we can sit together and talk with a group maybe half the size of this in a workshop like I would run, we will come up with solutions to problems that nobody ever realized. And what I've discovered is that most organizations, most community groups have 85 to 90% of the information they need already in them. They're just not talking to each other. And when they begin to talk to each other, they begin to discover they know an immense amount. And that really lifts them up, and they begin to feel much more like, well, maybe we can do something about this. And so my role when I'm leading workshops, I'm not a consultant. Consultants are a disaster. I'm a facilitator. I just ask questions. The problem with consultants is, they're fine folks. But if I'm the consultant and I come in and I tell you what the answer is, you all sit there and say, okay, the guy's crazy as hell, I'm not gonna do it. And I'll blame him for it. And we don't do it, or it fails, and it has no energy. And consultants wind up disempowering groups rather than empowering them. Because people sit back and say, well, he's got the answer, and I don't have to take responsibility to try it. But people can do stuff themselves, and by and large, they really like doing stuff. There's a lot of stuff about cybernetics I'm finding that goes on in organizations. Cybernetics is it's somewhere between science and philosophy, and it's about communications and control. It started in the Second World War when they're trying to figure out how to program machine guns so they could shoot down airplanes. The military still is very big on cybernetics. When you fire a rocket and you want it to hit something over there, it's a communication and control issue. What I found is cybernetics covers a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll touch on a little bit of it. It was very big up until the mid-70s, and then all the work on chaos and complexity came in and kind of ran over it. There's only one university in the world now which has a department for cybernetics, and that's in Australia. But I think it's maybe making a comeback. I just recently read this book on cybernetics for the 21st century. And I think it's resurfacing again in different ways. It may be very useful, but it touches everything we do. A few years ago, I got a call from the head of the American Society of Cybernetics. They wanted me to come and talk at their conference. I said, what's cybernetics? He said, that's what you're doing. I said, it is? I guess I better come and find out what the heck we're talking about here. But it's a matter of how we figure out how to have ASPEC. We heard some cybernetic stuff this morning with the announcements. How we're going to get more people to come in to be volunteers for whatever. And so it's a matter of communications and control of machines and living systems, which is ambiguous because I think you influence living systems and you control machines. There's no way in the world I'm going to control any one of you in here. I may have an influence, but I can't control you. And let me tell you, as a manager for big chemical plants in DuPont, I would never tell my boss that I couldn't control the place. Because my expectation was that I was totally accountable and responsible for everything. But I didn't know hardly anything. Because the people out there on the floor and in the shops around knew what was going on. And when we began to talk together, we came together in astonishing ways. It was amazing. And most people came together. Most people want to be treated with respect. Most people want to be listened to. Most people want to be able to talk about things. That's common for all of us. Yet in big organizations, we wind up treating people as if they're a bunch of brainless things that are getting in the way for getting our job done. It's totally upside down. So I got curious in working with this forum group, or were these founding fathers using these kinds of ideas as they wrote the Constitution? I've created this model which helps us to bring together our conversations and see. It's a complexity model. Call it the cycle of intelligence. It always begins with an opening question. Like, how do we improve this or that? And the group sits together and we talk about that question from the point of view of identity. You know, who are we? What's our history? What do we want to do? We begin to develop a shared awareness among ourselves about that. What are the issues and ambiguities? We talk about that and pretty soon develop a shared awareness. And so on around the circle. And we write that answers on the board. And when we're done, people have a living strategic plan for what they want to do to address that question. And they've looked at it from 9 perspectives. They can see the whole and the parts simultaneously, and the interactions of the parts. Because if one of these things changes, everything changes. And I'll talk more about that. And this is just the introductory model. There's a little much deeper behind this. But now let me talk about the Constitution. The 13 colonies had fought against the imperialistic dominance of the British Empire, the biggest military organization in the world at the time. Well, thank you, man. That's very kind. The first governing agreement they put together began during the war. It's called the Articles of Confederation. They were extremely concerned about power. They did not want centralized power because that's what they were suffering under with the king. And how they treated power was extraordinarily important. And so they put together the Articles of Confederation, which cover things like, you know, mutual protection from foreign powers and whatnot. But it wasn't working very well for them. And it was ratified in 1781. But by 1787, they decided they had to have a constitutional convention and write something that was better and more workable. One of the interesting things I've learned about our area where I live in the summer, we have a big Tuscarora Indian reservation right there in our community. I learned that that was the only Indian reservation in the country where the Indians had the choice of where they wanted the reservation. All the rest were assigned. And they were given this choice as a reward for supplying corn to Washington and Valley Forge. And they supplied corn across the mountains to them, and they still grow a plot of the same variety of corn as a memento up there on the reservation. I thought that was kind of interesting little sidelight, but at any rate. So they gathered together in Philadelphia in 1787, the 39 men, 29 states. There were about 3.4 million people in the country, including about 700,000 slaves. They wanted the power in the people, freedom of religion and press, trials with juries of peers, limited central government that would protect the country and manage the trade. So they had to create a new, unique relationship between people and government. They wanted something new. They just didn't want to take the same old and try to apply it in, because the systems and processes of governance are what make the difference. In the French Revolution, they didn't go after changing the way of the governance occurred. So they just threw out one bunch of scoundrels and brought in another bunch of scoundrels. And if you look at revolutions around the world, as I have, over the years, everybody has great hopes that after the revolution, something good's going to be. 5 years later, it's the same daggone thing that they've thrown out. Just different characters running it. And it's because the systems and processes are running underneath that govern all of that. I do a lot of work on industrial safety. And most people get hurt not because they're stupid and careless, but because the systems and processes that they're working in are driving to wrong behavior. And so we work on that kind of stuff a lot. They valued freedom and individuality and the right to bear arms. They wanted to avoid the tyranny of the majority. And so you had big states like New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and little states like Rhode Island and Delaware and South Carolina. There was a lot of concern what's going to happen to the little states if the big ones drive it all the time. So the tyranny of the majority was a big issue for them, and they struggled with it. And we still struggle with it. They wanted to balance the power of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They wanted to have a House of Representatives and a Senate with different ways to populate those. So they were very concerned about power and where should power be. And the power they felt should be among the people like us here. So they needed how to work out some things like how do you have a free election? Not have a tyranny of the majority. How do you balance the power? How do you bring the big and small states together? How do we create an army and a navy? How do we resolve the slavery problem? And they failed to do that during the convention. And I think the reason that failed was because they needed to have all the states come together to be a country that would be able to defend itself and engage in trade and not get taken over again by the French or the Spanish or the English and not be chopped up in little pieces. So that was probably a trade-off that they had to make. It wasn't that they were being hypocritical or whatnot. They knew they had a mess. And we finally did have a mess in the 1860s in the Civil War. They also had to figure out how are we going to support these kind of activities. We come down to 3 rules. Free speech and press and religion. That's life. These are the things that constitute that. We've got to have that. They needed to balance power and honesty and trust and independence. This is liberty. Liberty is not just freedom without responsibility. And they had to have responsible, engaged, resourceful citizens. People doing the things that were important, self-organizing around their particular interests, but not exploiting each other. And it comes down to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the 3 processes that support all that we do and still do. So they created a new form of government, and they intuitively used, I think, the complexity ideas. They chose a president rather than a king. And then they had the courage to try to see if it make it work. And some of them said it probably won't work beyond 1 generation because it was so fragile and so different. So I took the opportunity to use the cycle of intelligence and then the deeper tool, which I call the process enneagram, to take a look at this and what did they do and how did their work fit in with this modern complexity model, and did it fit? And I'll show you the model, and there's a lot of stuff listed. The things that are listed under each point are just listed in the order in which they came to my mind. If I was doing it with you, it might be a different listing, it might be different items. This is just done by myself, so it's weak in that regard. I use different colors just to help to try to read the darn thing so they don't get too messy. And again, I begin with this idea of the cycle of intelligence. What is going on? How do we learn? What is the work we're going to do? We develop a shared awareness about what we want to do and around what the problems are. Many times when I get together with organizations, they want to go and solve a problem. And I say, you can't do that first. You've got to spend some time talking about who are you? Why are you here? What is it you really want to do? And how are we going to work together? What are the agreements we're going to make so we can work together? Like the Constitution. The Constitution is basically an agreement among a bunch of people that had to get along but couldn't get along very well together. That's what we got. And it's trying to keep us all kind of corralled and unified. The process enneagram goes deeper. It gives us a whole systems view, so we see the parts and the whole and the interactions of the parts. It's a conversational process. It begins with a question. In my experience, this tool works everywhere. And the only criteria is that people need to be willing to sit together and talk and listen to each other. That's all that's required. Now, if they don't want to do that, there's no, we're done at the start. There's a 6-term dynamical process of how things happen, and the 3-term process is support, and I'll talk some more. It also shows that we have 3 levels of organizations going on all the time. They're different, but they're running simultaneously and interacting. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And when we write the things down in the wall chart, people remember the conversation. I used to chart like this with the mayor of Niagara Falls, New York, for 4 years. I started out on the wrong foot with them. I came in as a former plant manager, and I said, well, we ought to be able to take 20% of the cost of running the city out. Learned to have a revolution right then, because they said, what do you mean, we're working hard. At the end of 4 years, having used this tool, they took out $16 million out of a $62 million budget. The services improved. So it was kind of interesting to see. But they stayed in the conversation, which is really important. And what they do is co-create a living map. Because you change the map as things change. Tomorrow's different than today. We can have a good plan today, and tomorrow we're going to mess around with it a little bit because it's not quite the same. Okay, now here's the process enneagram a little differently. You see in the middle the same labels, identity and intention, all the way around it. The red pattern in the middle that goes from 1 to 4 to 2 to 8 to 5 to 7 and 1 is the pattern of how work takes place. And it's an interactive feedback thing going on all the time. And the pattern from 0 to 3 to 6 and 9 is the support pattern for this. And that's true in organizations. So the activity of getting stuff done is 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1. The support is always 0, 3, and 6, those activities. Now, when we talk about the principles and standards at level 3, these are the agreements we make up together, and since we did them together, we can all hold each other accountable regardless of level. And we talk together. And as a plant manager, I used to get hit over the head some days when I made mistakes and somebody would get after me. But we had to deal with that and learn together. That governs, whoops, let me go back. That governs kind of the moral behavior of the organization. If we want to accomplish these things, how do we have to work together? And people know how to do that. They come up with those answers. They know what they need to do. That's level 3. Level 2 is the people who are looking over the system, trying to make the decisions about what needs to be done, like the manager. And level 1 is where the people are actually doing the physical work. How many of you watch any of the basketball games on the TV this week? Or football games? You see these 3 levels running all the time. The referees are running level 3. They know the rules. They come in and they test things like the pressure of the ball to be sure that they're all right. Those kind of things. They try to maintain the order of the game as it's being played. If they don't do that well, the game falls apart and it's no longer a basketball game. So these principles and standards are really critical to hold this thing together. You see the coaches up and down the sidelines shouting at the guys and gals on the floor, talking to each other. Those are the level 2 work that's going on. And then you have the athletes on the floor making instantaneous decisions about what to do, who to toss the ball to next, and all that. 3 separate processes, all running simultaneously and highly interdependent. But unless you're paying attention, you don't even notice that. And so while a lot of us will use complexity ideas intuitively, in my perspective, trying to understand what's going on, I have to go deeper and begin to see these other patterns that are showing up. And then they lead us to do how we want to do work and how we do things. For example, when I was working on safety and helping our people, we got a 97% reduction in injury rate. I worked all the time at levels 2 and 3. I never did level 1 work. First off, I didn't know how to use a wrench. If I touched the control panel, I'd have probably pushed the wrong button and it would have been a disaster. I stayed away from the level 1 work because there were people out there that knew a heck of a lot more about that than I did. Much, much better. But we spent a lot of time talking about level 2 and 3 as I wandered the plant. And these higher levels drive the lower level. Okay, let's look at this process enneagram that I put together, beginning with a question. How can these 13 states develop a process to govern ourselves effectively and fairly? And it's about governance. It's not about structure as much as it is about governance, the processes we use to manage ourselves. So I just started to jot stuff down. So beginning at the top of the identity, it was a hot summer. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. We had 13 states, 34 men. Population of the country is about 3.4 million, about 700,000 slaves. Transportation was slow and difficult. Communications had to be by newspapers or letters and whatnot, and that was slow. That was the context in which they're working. What did they want to do in the upper right? The intention up here in this corner. They needed the new Constitution. Whoops. They didn't start from scratch. There were other models around that they played with, and they read an awful lot about the philosophy from Scotland. They wanted the dynamical balance of powers among the central government, the states, and the people. The citizens were the most important. They wanted to create one out of many. We had 13 states. They wanted to create one unity out of that. They wanted freedom of speech and press. They wanted to control the power of the central government. Most of the power remains with the states. We're still struggling over that issue right now. Okay, it doesn't go away. And they wanted to avoid the tyranny of the majority. What are the kind of problems they were looking at? Well, how do we bring one out of the many? How do you control money and mail? How do you keep the citizen primary? We don't have really a roadmap. We're creating something brand new here. They're worried about the concentration of power. They're worried about how do you resolve disputes, because that may take power to help resolve disputes. They're worried about taxation and postal services and protection for foreign powers. And they worried about slavery, but they couldn't solve that one. They wanted a relationship of balanced powers, shared values, respect and trust. And so when they look at the principles and standards, the blue one at the bottom on the right side, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were extremely important. When they first wrote the Constitution, it wasn't complete enough, and the states demanded more things, and we wound up with the first 10 amendments pretty quickly to improve the document. They wanted freedom of speech and press, and they felt the press ought to be the watchdogs of the governing people to try to keep them honest. There had to be a freedom of religion, and that is that none were sponsored by the government or supported by the government. They wanted free trade among the states, fair and honest elections, protection from foreign powers, and England didn't let go easily. If you read the history of the central part of the country, up in Ohio, western New York, the British kept control of those forts, and the British tried to still dominate and maintain their association with the Indians then against the U.S. folks. And it lasted that way until we had the War of 1812, which for most people in this country is not much known about, but up in Western New York, it was a heck of a big deal because there was a lot of fighting going on, trying to sort that all out. The work that they had to do was to create an election process, create taxation and mail service processes. They had to have a legislature that would decide on legislation, taxes, and budgets. An executive administers the government, and the judicial decides the legal issues. They were creating that. And they wanted these things to balance each other, these powers, because we couldn't get along, and they knew that power corrupts. And so they wanted ways to keep a balance and constrain it. We had to have a military. Again, the slavery issue they couldn't resolve. When it comes to information, they wanted free press, letters of correspondence, newspapers and pamphlets, and community conversations, which were extraordinarily important in these town meetings that would get together and people would talk about what's going on. How do we handle the commons, the city square, where everybody put their cows? And that kind of thing. You heard the theory of the tragedy of the commons, where people begin to exploit that. On learning, they wanted free, open conversations, community dialogues, free travel, and the ability to amend the Constitution because they knew things were going to change. They knew that, so they built a process in to modify it. And the last point up here, the context is the outside world they had to consider. They had to consider trade. We tended to produce the raw materials, and Europe tended to produce the finished products. That's why it was set up early on, and then it began to be up the northern states producing the finished products and the southern states producing a lot of raw materials. And they wanted freedom of the seas, because if you had trade, you got to control the seas, or have at least the ability to travel freely. The internal structure was a dynamical balance of powers and states' rights in the Bill of Rights. So I put this stuff together around this model, this complexity model. These folks had touched every point, and they did it very deeply, and they did it doggone quickly. You know, the convention only lasted a couple of months. This is an extraordinary amount of work to pull together. And then they write it up, it all fits in this. Okay, it's all here. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in this little booklet. Now, I'm involved with the committee in Niagara Falls County that's getting together to celebrate our 250th anniversary in a couple of years. So I volunteered to see if I could get some copies of the Constitution. I knew that Hillsdale College gave out free stuff, so I called them up. And I just wanted the name of their vendor, because if we could get the vendor, then they could print up copies for us. They wouldn't have to go through setting everything up, save a little money. 2 weeks later, I got 650 of these in the mail free. They're not quite free because there's a lot of postage, but nevertheless, these are the kind of things that need to be passed out so people can see what we're talking about. And you know, how many of you really read the thing from one stem to stern?
Read it once.
Yeah, once, 50 years ago or
Couple
something.
times.
It's kind of interesting to read this thing and try to understand, well, what did they mean by that? That's why we got the Supreme Court spending a lot of time trying to sort that stuff out. Now, the ideas that they were dealing with, fundamental, but we've got to keep it alive as we go through things. So since all this was written, there's been a heck of a lot of change. That column of blue stuff on the left side is just a few of the things I picked out. You can almost say we've been in crisis ever since we wrote the Declaration of Independence. You know, something has been leading us to disaster. We've had 27 amendments. And the three supporting processes of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are under attack. The press is not balanced and all that kind of stuff. And the question is, can we survive? So then I said, okay, and I'd like you to, you know, if you want to, you can play with these things. I used the same process and said, what do things look like now? This again, that's just my view. And you start to scan these things, we are really screwed up. There's a hell of a lot of stuff in every one of these areas that are significant problems. Now, you probably could add to the list, I'm sure you would. These are just my ideas of ruminating on this. And so how in the hell do we get out of this problem? You know, we can run around and fix this problem and this problem, but until we begin to work on the governance problems, we can't fix the ones at level one. It's just gonna keep popping up new ones. It'll be like whack-a-mole. We'll just go from this to this to this to this. We've got to raise up to higher levels of governance. So my view on this, using this model and what I've seen before, the most important step is to co-create a shared set of values that we all can live by. And right now, we don't have a set of values like that. And by co-creating, I mean, it's not something that somebody else tells you. It's a matter of us sitting together here and talking together. And what are the values we're willing to live by? All of us. And that all of us can hold each other accountable for. And then we begin to have the conversations at the local levels. I think change happens one conversation at a time. I don't know how you can scale it other than people sitting down together and talking. So we got to build networks across the country of groups that are talking, and there are a lot out there already. And our group is trying to figure out how do we network into other groups to begin to spread these conversations. So we've got three interacting parts of people's. We have to localize creativity. You folks here in this room know a lot more about ASPEC than anybody in St. Petersburg. And if they try to tell us how to run ASPEC, it would be a disaster, because they simply don't know you. They don't know what's going on. You know, they may be good intention, but they just don't know. We have to solve this locally. Our communities have to solve this locally. When I think about change, I think about an hourglass. The sand is falling from the upper chamber to the lower one grain at a time. And it lands in the lower pile, the potential energy builds a little. The next grain drops, it builds a little more. At some point, the pile slips. Most of the time, they're little. Sometimes they're intermediate, sometimes the whole pile collapses. It occurred to me that purposeful conversations among people like ourselves here are like the grains of sand. And at some point, as we have these conversations, things begin to change. But we have to pay attention, because most of the change is little. So if I was not walking the plant every day, I would have missed an enormous amount of change taking place in the little things that people were doing. I was talking to a guy who had lived behind the Iron Curtain for a long time. I said, I think the Berlin Wall came down because there were millions of conversations in street corners and bars and kitchens. And one night there was an ambiguous radio broadcast, and some guy went out with a hammer and started to knock it down and didn't get killed. Others began to swarm out. Putin, who was in charge at the time, called his superiors, who didn't call back right away. And by the time they did respond to him, there were thousands of people out there, and the whole thing had gone totally out of their hands, and the wall came down. There was no big convention. There was no big agreement among the states. It was just one night, the wall came down. And it was probably because of these conversations that build up and build up. Now, we don't know when the change that takes place is going to be little or middle-sized or big. And we don't know when, and we don't know which is going to happen next. By the way, this is the same pattern for earthquakes and traffic jams. Okay, it's the same. It's called power. It's a power model. If you plot the log of the intensity of the event versus the frequency of the event, you get a nice straight line. earthquakes behave this way. The tectonic plates press and press and press. Potential energy rises and then they slip. Most earthquakes are little. Now and then there's something in the middle, and then sometimes you get a giant one. But nobody can predict which ones are going to be happening when and next. So it's these phenomena help us. Learning to live with complexity helps us to live with ambiguity of not knowing what's going to happen next and not having a meltdown over that. So I put this thing together to see how we could go forward. So now we got to, let's say in 2087, we'll probably have a population of 400,000 people, 50 states. AI and GPT will be a big deal. Maybe we will have learned how to deal with those. Hopefully we'll have a high value for people. There'll be systems thinking. The Constitution will be amended properly. Shared values will have been developed. Our relationships will be of trust. The sustainability, we'll have food and health care for everybody. And no atomic weapons. That was sort of my ideas of playing with. The issue is how do we support and sustain these things? We come up with a good list, like a New Year's resolution list, which we can't sustain. We got to sustain this stuff. So we got to stick with it. We're going to have pretty much the same structure that we got now, but it's going to be working. And the citizens are resourceful and responsible in solving the problems in their communities. For example, a group that did this was after the COVID incidents in Buffalo, New York. They opened up the schools again. There were not enough bus drivers. And they discovered it wasn't because people weren't applying for the job. There weren't enough of applicants that were qualified. So they were having troubles getting the kids to school, sometimes delivering them back home at 9 o'clock at night, which the parents weren't too keen on. And so they sat down with the teachers union and with the school board, and they changed the schedule of the schools so that the elementary schools open an hour later so they can recycle the buses back and get everybody to where they need to be. That was solved by the people in the community. That was not solved by Buffalo City Council or the union by themselves, but it was a collection that solved that. We need more and more of that kind of problem solving. And so the question is, what's your path forward? Because each of you have a role in this. We just can't sit back and watch the country go down the drain. What is your role? What are you going to contribute? And part of it is the activity here at ASPEC, which is really important. But then how do you take this beyond? Who other people do you influence? It's not a passive thing that we're engaged in. We have to be active, in my view. One of the guys asked me, how come you're not more active in ASPEC? Well, I'm still working. I don't have time to come here every day. Last week I did a seminar for the Canadian Institute of Chemical Engineers on process safety. So, we keep at it. Not like I used to, but we keep at it. So I think that wrapping up, using the process enneagram to look at the Constitution, for me, was very fruitful to see how it all fit together and what these people did. And also it indicates the path forward. We've got to develop our shared values. We got to have communities talking together about what we need to do and then doing that, and the shift from consumers back to citizens, which is a big set. It's going to take a while. I'll stop there. Hope this has been of interest.
So, question, yeah, Sam.
One of the great dichotomies that I have found, and it's unique in the American Constitution versus others, was the tyranny of the majority. And whether it was Madison or Tocqueville or whoever named that way. But given that part of the Constitution, thinking about it, how do you jive that with the current legislative process, which even with one majority of a party over the other can completely change the laws of the country or rules of the country,
Well, I think,
disregarding the other 49%'s interest.
well, one thing is that people are not talking together. They're talking at each other. There's a struggle for power that's going on. We have the electoral college as one attempt to try to balance that. Another is that we got representatives based on population, 2 senators from every state to try to balance it. There are a lot of weaknesses in it. And the kind of thing you're bringing up here, there's some nights I've been reduced to watching Wheel of Fortune rather than the damn news. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes. I don't know if it sounds like you're not from here, you don't spend all year here, but in Florida, the legislature just has completed passing a number of laws that rescind the power of local communities to enact legislation. Much of that legislation protects consumers or workers. And basically the legislature has, over the past few years, tried to pull power back to the state level rather than the local level. Did your group enter any kind of objection to this? Did
Well, we
anybody
didn't.
intervene?
We weren't involved in the legislative process. But a year ago in January, Claire and I did a workshop for the League of Women Voters here around the gas plant and all this development of the ballpark and whatnot. And the objective was to find the voice of the voiceless. So we had 2 evenings of workshops with people from the community. What questions would you like to ask the mayor before they make their final decisions? And they came up with a list of really good questions and got excited enough that they actually had a proclamation they read from the steps of City Hall. I don't know if you saw that in the papers, but they did that. So it's an attempt to try to bring the citizens together to talk about this stuff and influence and be heard. So many people, they'll have a public meeting, you come and maybe your question will be considered and hardly ever will it be answered very well. And they think that's participation, and that's crap. That's not participation. That's just another way to manipulate the public, in my view. But so this group was to try to bring together the questions that they wanted to have the mayor and the committee to look at. And one of the things they have now is a committee that's supposed to look at affordable housing as they go through this and the other things that can be done to develop that 85 acres of ballpark around the stadium. That's the way we need to get involved. The citizens have to do this and the power of the citizens. Yes, Meredith?
I wondered about the government shutdown that is coming up probably this weekend and the tyranny of the minority that is creating this. Can you say something about that?
I think it's this abuse of power that you brought up over here that's going on. That people are thinking about themselves and their own power. They aren't thinking about the greater good and the greater whole. They aren't thinking about the implications of what they're doing in the greater whole. They're thinking about this next step and this next step. So I think that's part of the problem. We just aren't talking, Mary, like we really ought to. And another problem is that the founders didn't really appreciate was the role of lobbyists. And I've been told there are something like 5,000 or 6,000 lobbyists per elected congressperson. These are the people that are trying to run the country. And lobbyists usually have a fairly specific interest, which isn't necessarily good for all of us. It's their particular axe to grind. So that's a question now that we have is, how do we control that? Back in the early days, representatives represented a very small number of people compared to now. If we kept that same ratio going, we'd have a Congress of 10,000 people. That's probably not manageable. So these are really hairy problems. Yes.
Ernie.
Yes, one of the observations I had when we were talking through this is the value of peer learning, which is how we operate here.
Yes.
85% of the knowledge is already there. And it's just finding it from amongst ourselves and challenging it and balancing it. which is the real process. But is that essentially, that concept essential to your process as well? Seems to be.
The core of the process is for people like yourselves to have conversations about important questions that you're struggling with. And then use a guided process. That's important, to use this process or something like it. And then most of the time we can begin to come up with some pretty good answers about what we need. It may not be good enough, so we do it again. And we keep getting better and better and feeling our way along. We can't predict the future, so we may come up with something that we gotta play with that and change it a little bit. Does that help, Ernie? It's a matter of the knowledge and the wisdom in the communities that is so important, that is so untapped. Yes.
At the very end here, maybe bring it back to complexity theory again. The organizing principles of the system are being perturbed, pushed to extremes. Are we heading into chaos?
Are we heading where?
Into chaos? In other words, are we going to? Is the system? Is it resilient enough not to dissociate?
That's a good question, and nobody really has the answer for it. If we continue down the path we're on, with all the dissension or nobody talking, I think we're headed to a disaster. I think we got to figure out how do we sit down together and talk about this stuff and begin to sort it out. And a lot of it is about where does the power lie? Who has the power? Where should it be? And can the power move? In times of a crisis for the country, the power ought to become more centralized, like in the Second World War. But then afterwards ought to diffuse back again to the states and to the people. That takes lots of talking together and listening to each other, trying to figure out what's best, arguing like crazy, but being respectful and listening and working for the greater good. I don't know any other way to get at this, and it's not going to be quick. But I see a lot of activity going on, which to me gives me a sense that a lot of people are concerned, and a lot of people are trying to improve things. All the work is highly fragmented. And one of the things the forum wants to do is how can we begin to network some of these groups together?
Okay, well, thank you. Did you have a last question?
One adjunct to what Dick's wonderful lecture, groups that work together in person come up with answers much more quickly than groups that are working with Zoom or with any other communication other than face-to-face. There are a couple of papers on it in Scientific American recently, and we know that empirically to be true. So
Face-to-face is the best, but Zoom is a heck of a good tool for it.
It works to a point, but the difference is dramatic when they did the.
It can be, that's right. You can't read body language very well on Zoom. You had a question?
Yeah, I do, Richard. I'm fascinated by your work with the gas plant because I'm very deeply involved in that. In fact, 2 hours from now, I'm going to be talking in front of the city council. And I don't know how to get, right now we got 3 city council people, 3 want to change the deal and 2 undecided. And I'm struggling with how to, I want the current proposal stopped and reformatted. And how do you get people to listen?
Well, the first step is for people to be willing to listen and talk. And then the next step is the question, what does the system want to have happen? Not you, not me. What does the group of us want to have happen?
Right.
And so we need to explore that together because you'll have a perspective. You'll have a perspective. And we need to be working toward the greater good of the citizens of St. Petersburg.
Yes.
And how can we achieve that? And part of it is around affordable housing.
Right.
Part of it is to take care of some of the grievances from the past when it was just taken from the community, back in the late 70s. There's things that need to be considered and talked about. And people have to be willing to say, yeah, we need to do this. Maybe there's something more I need to understand together. But that needs to be a facilitated conversation because it can go crazy and people can go take off. So how do you keep people in the room? How do you keep them together without getting them PO'd while you're doing it? That's one of the skills that we try to bring to this thing, to bring groups of people together. And mostly it's treating people with respect, saying others have to talk, we need to listen, just explaining carefully. And then behaving as facilitators ourselves, the way in which we want the people to behave. I was doing a workshop in Australia with a coal mine. The union and management, they were going to have a strike. The mine economically was quite weak and the strike would kill it. As we're introducing ourselves, I introduced myself as a former plant manager. This great big union guy jumps up and he raises hell for about 5 minutes. How can a manager do this and all that? So I said, okay, I want you to watch me. If I get out of line, I want you to tell me, would you do that? He hardly knew what to say. He said, yeah, and he sat down. At the end of the 2 days, he gave me a hug because I had behaved. but it's a matter of not running from that challenge, but putting the challenge kind of back into them. So how can we come together? But we have to talk with, not at. Ernie?
Thank you.
Well,
Well,
just
we're out of time.
if I could just say one thing, that for everybody in this room, ASPEC was asked by League of Women Voters to bring those 2 sessions together, which Dick did. And this was 2 sessions of highly diverse people, leaders in the community, highly diverse.
None of them I ever had met.
Diversity really mattered in this instance. And Dick was able to keep that group talking and actually reaching a consensus. 2 separate evenings, 2 consensi. And how often does that happen? So there's something there very, very special about this process that he describes. But it happened because League of Women Voters asked for it, because ASPEC had the facility, and Dick was here, and
Claire was with me. She
well, she was critical.
They like her a lot
Let's just say
better
that.
than me.
Let's say that. The female side of this is always critical, and it worked. Fascinating.
Thank you very much. Mayor.
Thank you very much.